The snow fell soft that season, not to cleanse, but to quiet. Clint Barton moved through it like a man chasing stillness. Not justice, not vengeance, just silence. A silence he had earned through battles that took more than blood. A silence he was afraid to enter, but too tired to resist. He wasn't running anymore. He was retreating, not from duty, but from the shadow it left behind. Ronin had vanished, but the weight of his blade still lingered in his bones. In the corners of his thoughts, he didn't need another mission. He needed a reason to come home, and stay there. Every arrow he loosed came with memory. Every glance carried the ghost of a friend who never made it back. Guilt clung like frost on his skin. Not loud, not obvious, but deep, unshakable. And somewhere in that quiet storm, a voice rose. Not to replace him, but to remind him. He didn't have to be alone. Kate Bishop was not his mirror. She was his contrast. Full of questions, full of fire, full of everything Clint thought he had lost. And through her, the story changed. Not from destruction to healing, but from legacy to liberation. She wasn't just the next chapter. She was the proof that the book could end in peace. Sometimes letting go isn't surrender, it's growth. Sometimes walking away isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Clint didn't pass the torch to escape. He passed it because he finally believed someone else could carry it, and in that belief, he found release. Not from pain, but from the need to wear it like armor. In this video, we unravel the true heart of Hawkeye's story. Not as an origin, not as an encore, but as an epilogue to a life spent giving. We explore how the show was never really about Clint saving the day, but about Clint learning to step away, to pass the bow, to find forgiveness, and to finally let go. When the show began, it looked like another return, another hero stepping back into the shadows to clean up old messes. But Hawkeye wasn't just a continuation, it was a transition, a subtle shift from legacy to release. From the past to the uncertain glow of tomorrow. Clint Barton didn't need redemption, he needed silence, not applause, not revenge, but a moment to breathe in the aftermath of too many losses. The series wasn't his resurgence, it was his surrender, a gentle unraveling of a man held together by obligation, by grief disguised as resilience. We watched a warrior haunted by ghosts, but also a father searching for rest. His strength wasn't in the arrows he loosed, it was in the memories he couldn't. And in Kate Bishop, he saw not just potential, but permission. Permission to stop, permission to trust, permission to finally loosen his grip. This wasn't about one more mission, it was about closure, about teaching someone to stand so he could finally sit. And in every rooftop conversation, in every reluctant nod, in every pause between words, we felt him drift further from the fight, not in weakness, but in peace. The show asked us not who Clint was, but who he needed to become. And the answer was never more weapons, never more battles. The answer was quiet, human, earned. The answer was to let go. Clint wore guilt like armor, polished through repetition, hardened by regret. Every time he smiled, you could see the cracks. Every time he walked, you could hear the weight of those he lost. He wasn't haunted by what he did, but by what he couldn't undo. He never asked to be forgiven, because he never believed he deserved it. He counted casualties more than victories. He remembered the snap, the silence, the sacrifice, and in that memory, he buried the man he used to be. He buried the man who laughed freely, who fought for joy instead of obligation. Ronin wasn't a phase, it was punishment. A blade turned inward while pretending to strike out. He didn't wear that hood to hide, he wore it to disappear, not from enemies, but from himself. Because the version of Clint that survived Endgame was not the one who went into it. That version of Clint never left, not really. It sat beside him in quiet corners, it whispered in reflections. It haunted him like unfinished business, and every step toward healing felt like betrayal. Like abandoning the pain meant abandoning those he carried with him. Nat, the people he couldn't save, the years lost to rage. But the truth is, healing isn't erasing, it's surviving. It's choosing not to live inside the wound. It's recognizing that guilt might never leave, but it doesn't have to lead. And frustration comes not from the scars, but from the fear that peace is a lie. There's sorrow in knowing when it's time to stop, not because you're broken, but because you're finally whole enough to walk away. Clint's journey was not about glory, it was about grief, and how quietly it lives in the bones, how loudly it echoes when the world goes quiet. Natasha was never far from his mind. She was the missing rhythm in his pulse, the shadow cast across every laugh. He wore her last like a second skin, and every step with Kate was a step further from the place they last stood together. Every arrow drawn was a memory, every silence a conversation unfinished. Legacy is cruel, because it demands remembrance and release. Clint had to remember what made him who he was, and then release it, so someone else could rise. Not as a copy, but as a continuation. Not to replicate the pain, but to honor it with growth. Watching him pass the bow wasn't just symbolism, it was sacrifice, letting go of the thing that once gave him purpose, because he found a new one, in family, in peace, in simply being Clint. Not Hawkeye, not Ronin, not Avenger, but father, husband, human. And in that quiet surrender, there was a tenderness, a kind of mourning that felt like love, a kind of goodbye that didn't need words, only understanding. And maybe that's what legacy truly is, not what you leave behind, but who you allow to rise in your place. Kate Bishop wasn't just a fan, she was a flame, burning bright with curiosity, reckless but radiant. She didn't want to replace Clint, she wanted to earn her place beside him. And in her eyes we saw what the next chapter could look like. Not a shadow, but a spark. There was awe in the way she fought, not because she was flawless, but because she never hesitated. She stumbled, but stood taller. She questioned, but never quit. And that courage, that relentless drive, it woke something in Clint he thought was lost. Not just hope, but hunger. For legacy that meant more than pain. Passing the torch isn't just about skill, it's about spirit. Kate didn't need his approval, she needed his belief. And when he gave it, something shifted, not just in her, but in him. A spark reignited, not to keep fighting, but to finish writing his part of the story, to close the chapter without burning the book. The show became more than an epilogue, it became a prelude, a promise that the bow would not be forgotten, that the lessons would live on, not in repetition, but in evolution. Kate didn't have to be Clint, she had to be more. She had to be herself, and as the city lit up with chaos and color, we realized that this wasn't the end of Hawkeye. It was the beginning of something bold, something beautiful, a reflection of what was, and a firework of what could be. Letting go is an act of faith, trusting that what comes next will matter, even if you're not there to see it. Clint didn't walk away from duty. He walked toward life, toward warmth, toward stillness, toward everything he missed while surviving. It wasn't abandonment, it was awakening. The show whispered what most stories shout. The endings aren't always explosions. Sometimes they're a hand on a shoulder, a nod across a room, a quiet exit while the world keeps turning. A goodbye that isn't dramatic, but deeply earned, shaped by time instead of trauma. There's hope in that. In knowing the fight doesn't need to last forever. That maybe you don't need to bleed to prove you cared. That maybe walking away isn't failure, but freedom. The kind of freedom that comes when you've given everything. And finally, choose yourself. Kate didn't need saving. She needed space to become. And Clint gave her that. Not with lectures, but with trust. With shared silence. With lessons built on mistakes. With presence. Even in absence, a mentor who knew when to speak, and when to step back. Hope lived in the stillness, and the way he finally let himself smile. Not because the pain was gone, but because he knew it was time to stop carrying it alone. And sometimes, the most heroic thing you can do is step away from the battle, and believe that someone else can win it. Every goodbye is a little death, a quiet ending that echoes louder the longer you sit with it. Hawkeye didn't scream farewell. It whispered it through snowfall, through silence, through the way Clint finally stopped running. Not from enemies, but from memories. Tragedy doesn't always come with tears. Sometimes it's the sound of peace after years of noise. Sometimes it's the moment a warrior sets down his weapon, not because he's too weak to lift it, but because he's finally strong enough not to. There's power in that kind of stillness. And sorrow, too.